He is the head of mobile at BBI with over a decade of experience in the development and delivery of next generation diagnostic technologies within mobile health. Since the acquisition of Novarum in 2016, Neil has overarching responsibility for all things mobile at BBI Group. And Neil and his digital team of software developers ensure that customers unlock the value created from this technology. So without further ado, I'll pass you over to Neil as he takes you through today's session. Thank you.
Thanks, Ros. Okay, and what I'm hoping to talk about today is diagnostics as a journey, and the journey that patients go through when they're testing, or clinicians go through when they're testing, and how we can help make that journey easier to navigate with a mobile application. I'm going to start by talking about how people should go about understanding their particular use case and some of the challenges and problems that they need to get their head around, really before they engage on developing a mobile solution to support a test application. Then I'll move on to talk about developing the complete service and some of the features which we'll call out as particular examples around reducing error and how to make that a better offering for your patients or your end users. I'll highlight some, but certainly not all, of the pitfalls that people might encounter along the way, and how you can try and avoid some of them. And then we'll finish off by talking about where you might start to begin to unlock the value and how you might engage on a project to do that. I guess the key thing that we want to get across today is that we believe that mobile should be an important part of your competitive strategy. If you're a diagnostics company, if you're providing diagnostics tests, or even if you are a large consumer of diagnostics tests, then you should probably be considering where mobile fits within your portfolio of products. Key thing that we need to think about is solving the whole problem. Diagnostics companies are obviously experts in their particular antibody, antigen, biological reagent, and disease states. They really understand those. They understand their test kits, and they understand how to make those work. But often we find that they don't really understand the whole problem and the whole journey that's necessary, right from the start of somebody wanting to do a test, and maybe even why they want to do a test. Where do we get hold of it? How intuitive it is to use and to understand the outcomes, where things go wrong in the test. And when we dig deep with diagnostics companies, we do find that most of them recognize a lot of the common errors there, and we'll certainly talk about those later. But we also know that there are some hidden errors that people either don't know or don't like to admit that come up in these tests. And then what does someone do with the outcome of the test? Where do they go? How does that get reported? What action do they need to take? And we split this whole thing down into three kind of clear, distinct phases when we're planning out what a project is, what a product or a mobile solution should look like. We call them the pre-test workflow, the in-test workflow, and the post-test workflow. Pre-test workflow being everything that comes before you open the packet of tests. The in-test workflow being the stuff you're doing with that specific patient with that test that you've just unwrapped. And then the post-test workflow is, I now have a test result. I've read a test, I've got a result. What happens to it now? And that, while those are the three kind of clear bits of the journey, we begin by actually asking a whole lot of questions which fit into all sorts of different places in that journey. So that's what the end product is like. It fits into those three kind of distinct stages. But we're going to ask ourselves a lot of questions to help work out the destination we're trying to get that journey to. So, clear message I'm trying to get across here is that you need to think about the whole journey for the diagnostic and not just about how the assay works and how great the individual biology is. Now, one of the things that can be tempting to do is to assume that every test really deserves to have a mobile application attached to it. It was a temptation of ours at BBI when we first began, and we first began working with mobile technology. And then we really started to distill down to which tests are most suited to having mobile as a value add on top of them. And what we've identified is that it's really these points that are highlighted on the bullet point here. So if the test is being performed by a low-skilled user, that may not mean that they are low-skilled in what they do in their everyday job. They may be a highly skilled engineer They may be a doctor, they may be a surgeon, they may be really, really good at what they do every day, but they are not a laboratory technician who's gone through a lot of training and who does testing every single day. Of course, it may be a patient testing at home. It may be the first time they've ever done a test, as we're starting to see more and more places going that direction with COVID testing at the moment, is getting tests into the hands of patients themselves, in which case you've got not someone who's stupid, but someone who has never done any diagnostic test in their life before, or perhaps has done a pregnancy test, but where the implications of getting it wrong are perhaps not so serious. So we would still count them as a low-skilled user. If they're doing it in a remote location, so if they're physically away from the type of lab infrastructure that puts in place quality systems and management controls, which help to make sure that people do testing right, then it's really useful to be able to have some extra control of them and to make sure that the data gets back to where you require it centrally. Obviously, if you want geographic information, epidemiological information, so information about where test results are coming from, it's far better to be able to gather that from someone capturing mobile information literally from the point of care, or literally from a patient's bedside, or literally from a farmer's field if it's a non-medical application, and get that information back with a geolocation, so latitude and longitude attached to it. You'll be able to do far more there than if you've got a self-reported information about a postcode or a zip code that identifies where someone lives. Then the other area, and I think this is the area which people tend to assume we talk about when we talk Novarum technology and our patent protected imaging technology, is when the test is particularly hard to interpret. Obviously, if a test is qualitative, people tend to think that it's easy enough to read a line, whether it's present or absent by eye. We'll get to some data later on which kind of will highlight the challenges that come with that, particularly with inexperienced people, but which can also creep in the more tests people have seen as well. But also, if you add other lines in there, so if you have multiple lines on a test, if you have multiple tests in the same housing, so multiplex tests with multiple strips, or if you have competitive assays where the line disappears rather than appears in the presence of a sample, these become harder to read, especially if you read a pregnancy test one day where it's a normal 2 lines is positive, and then the next day you have to read a drugs of abuse test and it's a competitive assay and works the other way around. It becomes very confusing. Even becomes confusing for those of us that work in the industry as to which way this particular test works. So those things make the test harder to interpret, as can anything where the outcome is not quite clear cut. So perhaps you have a relatively poor sensitivity and specificity. Perhaps it's a screening test. Perhaps you need to feed in other information as well as the actual outcome of the test. So those things all seem to tie into making mobile a good way of bringing all of that information together, managing a low-skilled user in a remote location and getting the data back where you want it. So having identified that we think there might be an opportunity for a mobile app to solve the problems of managing the diagnostic journey, we then start to ask ourselves some questions. So typical who, why, where, what, when type questions. And we start with asking where. Where will someone do the test? So what's the physical location like? Are they going to be doing it at the roadside on a drugs of abuse test, which might be in complete darkness or might be in bright sunlight? Will they be doing it in their own home, where lighting is variable and unusual? So we may be in bright light, or you may be in the evening. You may be in Scotland where you don't get bright sunshine, or you may be, just in a bedroom where maybe the lights are not quite as bright as others. Who will actually be doing that test? Where else might they do that test? Sorry, I'll jump on to who in a minute, but where else might they be doing the test? Maybe normally you do the test at home, but actually sometimes you'll occasionally have to do it at work, or you'll have to do it on holiday. Those are different environments that you have to consider. Where will they go to for help or advice? So when something goes wrong with a test, or when they get a result, where are they going to turn to for help and advice and information? Where will they know to download the app from? The obvious answer is they're going to download it from the Apple App Store and they're going to download it from the Google Play Store. But how will they know to look there? That sort of information. Many of our apps are developed so that they have a username and password. Someone logs into the app, they log into a service which is typically storing the results on the back end for them, so storing them in the cloud usually. And so they'll need a username and password. How do they get that? Is it something they can sign up for themselves? Is it something they can use their existing company account for? If they work for a health service, can they use their health board account? Or if it's an over-the-counter app for patients testing themselves, perhaps they can sign in with their social media account so they don't need to create another account and remember another password. And that all ties into with where the results ultimately go from the app. So those results may just stay on the phone. They may not go anywhere else, but increasingly we see that people want to send the results back to some sort of central location, or at least to back the results up into the cloud. So there's a safe store of them, and if you change phone, you can pull them back down onto the new phone, those sorts of things. We need to understand those things so that we can design a solution that's going to work. And if we're talking about physically where those results are stored, then it's also worth anyone who will be collecting data from European subjects, so people who are citizens of the EU, that they have a GDPR complication there, and that they need to make sure that the data is either stored somewhere within the European Economic Area or is in a country that has appropriate agreements about how data is stored in the European Economic Area. And you'll find similar concerns if you try to store data from patients in Canada and also in some parts of the US. And so you might end up having to store different patients' data in different countries. I guess the key thing to take away here is that the very highest volume of testing is for a very small number of tests that are actually not performed in traditional labs. Hundreds and hundreds of different lateral flow type tests used and similar technologies used, but actually only a relatively small niche of those are actually the really high volume applications. But those really high volume applications are not run in traditional clinical laboratories. We then ask ourselves, how does someone do the test? That's about the instructions for use, but it goes beyond that as well. It goes into what are they going to be doing at the same time? Are they running one test at a time, or are they lining up 10 tests at a time in some sort of clinic environment where they want to screen large numbers of people? If it's a test that takes 20 minutes for the test to develop and incubate, what else are they doing at the same time? Are they trying to use their phone to make a phone call? Fine, you can design that capability in. Are they off making a cup of tea? They've walked away from their phone. They won't notice that the time is running out, and we need a very noticeable alarm to alert them to come back and read the test. How will they get the result? Now that might sound daft. You run the test, you get the result that's right in front of you. But actually, you may not always want someone to get the result themselves. You may want to censor that result so that someone doesn't get bad news from their mobile phone, but rather someone reads the test, and if the outcome of that test is bad news, that perhaps they're getting a phone call from someone who can be a little bit more compassionate, or help them understand the result, or help them understand what it is that they now need to do. And often these tests will not be definitive diagnostic tests. They will be very reliable screening tests, but where some sort of follow-up is required. That might be a second test run in a clinical lab. It might be a biopsy. It might be that they need to come in and get an x-ray, something like that. So it's about how does that fit in with the rest of the user's day in terms of what they're doing, and how does that fit in with the rest of their life as well. So the outcomes of some of these tests can be life-changing, so it's important that we don't just think of it as a mobile app and that's going to tell someone perhaps that they've got cancer, or perhaps that they have HIV. It's got to be thought of as part of a bigger service there. Then, and I was jumping ahead earlier, this is the who. And the obvious thing is, who is the person being tested? So who's the patient? But it's also who's performing the test. And sometimes those are one and the same, particularly if you're talking about someone testing at home. But it may not be the same person. It may be there's a caregiver of some sort, so someone in a care home, or someone at home who's testing an elderly relative. It may be that the doctor or a nurse is performing the test on a patient. So it's understanding those subtle differences, and that has quite a profound impact on exactly the features and the workflow that you might design within an app. And then who needs the test result? Again, that might be exactly the same person that's just done the measurement. It may not be. It may be a nurse who's making the test on behalf of a patient, and actually it is a doctor that needs to get that test result. So it's about understanding what else has to fit together and who else needs access to that data. Sometimes there may be other people who need access to the data who aren't even the person that needs immediate access to the result. So the doctor needs the result, but someone at the Office for National Statistics needs to be able to track and trend data on a bigger scale, not about that individual patient, but a kind of larger demographic scale. How are you going to help someone understand that data and its meaning? So if a test has 95% diagnostic sensitivity and specificity, which for most lateral flow tests would be, considered pretty reasonable, then how do you make sure that that person understands that 1 in 20 of those tests is going to give a false positive and 1 in 20 is going to give a false negative, and what that means for them and how they should respond to that and what action they should or shouldn't take? And that may be as simple as how you present that information, and that's got a lot to do with who's going to receive it. You can, if someone has a degree in medicine, they understand sensitivity and specificity. If it's a person testing at home, they will probably take the 95% as being really, really reliable, when in fact it's not necessarily quite as to be trusted as that. Who's paying for it all? That's a key question we'll come right to at the end as well, about value and making sure that you are extracting the value from the system. But who is paying for the test? Who's paying for any app if there's a charge for that? And how does that all tie together? Who's managing the data? That may be that you're asking BBI to actually physically store the data on your behalf, but who's managing the data within your organization? It may be you don't even touch the data at all and it goes direct from a mobile application to an electronic health record. All of these things are options. Who's going to verify that each batch of tests will work with the system? And we quite often see manufacturers asking to put in the ability to manage different cutoffs or limits of detection on different lots of tests, because manufacturing lateral flow tests on paper looks really, really simple, but anyone that works in the industry will tell you that actually getting good lot-to-lot consistency is really quite difficult, and so, especially with biologicals involved, as well as the physical manufacturing process. And so having that ability to check each individual lot is performing is a kind of key thing that needs to go into any test, but someone's got to do that. So some QC person will be doing some testing. A critical question that we always ask is who will be the legal manufacturer? The easiest solution is usually that the person or the company that manufactures the test, that's the legal manufacturer within the regulations for making the test kit, is also the legal manufacturer for making the mobile application. But it doesn't need to be like that. We do have some applications recently we've been working on where the legal manufacturer will actually be quite separate to the test kit manufacturer. And that's dealt with by means of a technical agreement between the two organizations saying, we understand it's going to be read by a machine or by a camera vision system. We understand that if we move the line positions, for example, that may break things. So we will tell you in advance before we move the line positions, those sorts of agreements. And typically the legal manufacturer of the test will want to have some control over the sort of claims you're making in your mobile application as well. So that you're not claiming things that the test itself can't do unless you've got some validation that shows that the test plus a mobile application performs better than the test on its own. Anyone collecting data in Europe will be well aware of the issues of being a data controller, and so for GDPR, who is the data controller of personal data that you're collecting? And almost all of these systems will be collecting some sort of personal data. So who's controlling that? Who's responsible for that? And then if you are using someone else as a data processor, for example, if you ask BBI to store that data for you, manage the data infrastructure for you, we would be a data processor. Then who's that data processor and how are you controlling them? And who's going to help when someone has a difficulty? It would be naive to assume that anyone can make a mobile application which will have no user errors in it and no problems in it, and everyone will install and get to work perfectly the first time. Obviously, what we try to do is design the journey to minimize the number of problems you encounter, But there will be problems, and there will be problems in the test because people will do something wrong, or a component will be missing from a kit. You know, a pipette may be missing, or a buffer bottle might have been missed out of a kit. So who's going to deal with all those? Probably you want one unified call center dealing with any inquiries like that and supporting your post-market surveillance. But it's important that you think about these things early and think about whether or not there's a need for the mobile application to interface directly with them, whether that's as simple as just having a call for help button, or whether that is more sophisticated and that you have an in-app chat type system. So those are the sort of things you need to think about. Who and the regulatory and validating burden is very similar for the test regardless of who the user is. You still will have to do a lot of the same things. There's a temptation in the industry that we've seen to say, well, we'll start off just doing professional use and we'll worry about lay users later. But we bring back the question whether that's solving the whole problem, particularly in times at the moment where we actually don't want people to go to doctor's surgeries and doctor's offices, and we'd rather people were perhaps able to test themselves at home. So think about that and consider whether or not actually you're better to solve the problem for the patient rather than just replace a small part of the existing system. So I've talked a lot there about the questions you need to ask before you start, and I almost finished this first section. The practical considerations about the test, these are the things that you know all about anyway. So what does the test measure? How does it help diagnose that? Or what condition does it help diagnose? What else might you combine with that? Are there surveys, questionnaires, or symptoms that you might combine to help to make a diagnosis or prognosis? And what action do you want that person to take now that they've got a positive or negative result? And the things that can go wrong with the test, and that's really what I'm going to come on to talk about in just a moment. It's only once we've done all the first steps of the who, the where's, the whys that we start to really focus on the individual test kit, because we think diagnostics manufacturers tend to focus on their kit. It's the thing they know most, so they tend to want to talk about and focus on that stuff first. But actually, all of those other questions that I was asking, the who, where, what's, they are all the things about how the kit is going to get used in the field, and therefore how it's going to get used with a mobile app. So a little summary of where we've got to so far. I'm saying design the whole solution, understand your users, understand how it needs to interact with other systems, focus on the whole journey, not simply diagnostic performance, and include views and opinions from as many people as possible, so you're not reacting to one particular person's point. Before I move on to talk about some of the difficulties that people have in tests and how we can help to use mobile to overcome those, just might be worth seeing if there's any questions so far.
Hi Neil, we have had one question in, and that was, could you explain the highest volume testing is not in traditional labs part in your presentation?
Yeah, so when you look at where the really large numbers of diagnostic tests are for individual tests, disease states, the really large numbers of testing are for things like glucose, pregnancy, fertility. Those are tests which are performed at home by patients themselves, rather than for individual disease states, which may be very big numbers in themselves, but are niche within the total numbers in terms of hundreds of millions of tests. So if you want to sell really big volumes of tests, you've got to find a way of getting the testing closer to the point of use and to the patient, genuine point of care stuff or genuine self-test stuff, rather than it going to a lab. And some of that may be about getting the decision making so that they can get real-time instantaneous results. If a doctor has to wait 24 hours for a result back from a lab, they may decide to rely on other information to make their judgment. So it's about trying to help doctors to get the information quickly, and that will help you sell more tests.
Thank you, Neil. There was one more. I don't know whether we have time for this, so I'll ask at the end.
Go on.
Yeah, okay. Usability engineering is really important in medical device software, and what's our experience within that? Thank you.
Okay, well, I guess that feeds nicely into the next stage that we're about to talk about, actually. So, usability engineering is absolutely critical, and this is about recognizing where problems occur and difficulties occur. So, let me kind of answer that by moving on to the next section of the webinar. Actually, that's probably the easiest way to cover that. Everyone should be doing usability engineering of some sort for any medical application, and we generally apply exactly the same philosophy and approach for non-medical applications as well. Essentially, the way we build a mobile application is we take care of the engineering aspects of that for you with your inputs, and we will customize and build an app that's built around your user and your use case. And then after it's gone through appropriate validation work, that app's put in the App Store. It's downloaded in the App Store by the user who runs a test. And at some point during the running the test, they will often scan a barcode that's on the test or the test packaging. They may well do that before they even scan the test, before they even unwrap the test. And then at some point during that, they will scan the test results. So they will read the test using the phone. That's where our core IP comes. And we have a process which is painless for the end user, is as simple as scanning a QR code, and you'll see a very quick demo of that as we go through, but which ultimately removes a huge amount of the errors that can come with the usability factors, which we're about to talk about. And then automatically the system will connect and transfer that data to a back end. So the user journey involves kind of 5 of those 6 steps that we deal with the front end one first of all, but actually making sure that steps 2 to 6 there are as pain-free as possible for the user, and that usability engineering is really well done, then is about designing that first step properly and really designing it so it's robust and easy to use in the first place. And I said earlier that a lateral flow test might have 95% sensitivity and specificity, and that would be fairly reasonable and quite common for a lateral flow test. That would be quite common for the data that a manufacturer publishes on a lateral flow test, often even up into the very high 90s. But I think it's a little bit like the fuel consumption figures on your car. When the car manufacturer says it will get 50 miles to the gallon, nobody actually totally believes that, and everybody kind of knows and understands that when you put it in the hands of an ordinary user, using it in an ordinary way outside that controlled test environment, the performance may well be less than that. And we see errors coming in all sorts of different ways. So we see errors in how you perform the test. I'll talk through some of those in just a moment. We see bias in how you interpret the result. Again, I'll talk about that. And then we see errors on acting on the result, and we don't specifically talk about that in these slides, but if you tell someone they're positive, do they do the right thing? Do they initiate the right treatment? Do they approach their doctor? What is it that you're expecting someone to do? All of those things can result in errors, and they essentially can reduce the real sensitivity and specificity that is seen in the field. And there are a number of published studies around which compare the real sensitivity and specificity in real use cases to the manufacturer's kind of original product claims. Those things will see either patients going untreated because we've missed actual positive results, infectious diseases spreading because we're not capturing all of those positive cases, or healthcare and economic costs attached to failing to recognize disease. Or the opposite way around, if we've lost specificity, then we will see patients being treated unnecessarily, sometimes with treatment risks, sometimes with unnecessary emotional stress if you tell someone that they have a condition that they don't, and obviously with treatment costs as well. And for some of the largest volume tests, so your malarias and your HIVs, the volumes or the values of testing which may be going on, values of treatment which may be going unnecessarily because of a relatively small number of false positives, runs into hundreds of millions of dollars. So being able to produce a test which in the field still has the sensitivity and specificity you can achieve in your laboratory is actually really important and has real value to the person paying for those treatments, because they can target those treatments at the people that really need them, and they can reduce unnecessary treatment on patients. That is ultimately where you turn that volume of testing outside the lab into value. Okay, right. So when we look at what goes wrong in testing, we see that this is a typical diagnostics workflow here. So this is how you typically work through many of the point of care test kits on the market. And we talk to people like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and we agree with them that there are 6 key points of error in there, and they're the ones that are highlighted in red on this slide. So I will just quickly highlight some of the things that we do to solve the errors that happen there, or at least address them. So key thing, very, very high number of people do not check the expiry date on test kits when they're being used in the field. So even in supervised studies, when you know someone is watching you use the test kit as part of a study, up to nearly 80% of people were not checking the expiry date. You can imagine that's even higher in the wild without supervision. Simplest thing you can do there is we use a barcode to read the lot number from the test, match that to the expiry date, and check that. That introduces possibility for some extra safeguards. So we can have the ability to do what we call a virtual recall. So we can turn a batch off or a lot off if a fault is discovered after it's left the factory, without the huge costs that come with doing traditional product recalls. The app would simply refuse to read it, probably with a helpful message on the screen telling you why and what to do about it, where to return them and where to get a new test kit from. We can ensure the correct test is being used. So sometimes there are different test kits for different situations. That might be depending on whether someone's age or someone's prior medical conditions or whatever. So make sure someone's using the right kit. And that becomes particularly complicated if you have either multiple manufacturers, all with, let's say, malaria tests, or if you have the same manufacturer all using the same cassette, and therefore easy to confuse, and you accidentally run a dengue test instead of a malaria test. And then increasingly of concern to the industry is the possibility of counterfeit tests, so either cheap clone tests which aren't from the actual original manufacturer and may have nothing like the same performance characteristics, or fraudulent tests where a test's been used perhaps before and is run out of sight of the patient, and then miraculously a test result comes back from that saying that you need something, and guess what, that person has just the cure that you need. So those issues are increasingly of concern, particularly in sub-Saharan African markets, and through scanning barcodes we can help to reduce the potential for those. The next area where we see errors happening is people not following the instructions properly. So people failing to put the correct amount of volume, sample volume on there or buffer on there. And we can do that by guiding them through instructions for use with a set of videos or pictures, words, even audio, to guide them through and make sure that they follow it right. Even with training, you can expect that a significant number of people make some sort of error with these steps. Measuring the amount of blood, drawing it up, putting it in the right window of a lateral flow test is not completely foolproof. Adding the right amount of buffer to the right window is not completely foolproof. And again, these errors happen even in supervised studies when someone's watching over your shoulder. Job aids can help, but they don't completely eliminate it. And particularly don't completely eliminate it over time, so it becomes easy to become complacent 3, 6, 12 months later, and the references are on these slides, so you can go back and look at these studies and see the actual data that they were seeing and where these errors were creeping in. We can help to provide those instructions. Obviously, if you do the same test several times a day, every day, you can start to become very proficient at it, and you might decide that for certain types of user, if they've logged in and they've done a certain number of tests in the last week, month, whatever, that they're allowed to skip some or all of those instructions. Probably if you ask most manufacturers, what's the one thing you could do to really get the test result wrong? The thing that will get a wrong test result on almost every lateral flow test kit is either reading it too soon, or in some cases, leaving the test kit lying around for several minutes after it should have been read, and then picking it up to read it. You will get either a false negative, usually from reading it too soon, or a false positive from leaving it lying around and then picking it up and seeing a very faint line on what would have been a negative test at the correct read time. You're seeing, not far off a third of users not waiting the correct time. And that's in situations where people actually have timers around. If you put it into people's own homes and you've not provided a timer in the test kit, you can probably expect even less accuracy in the timing that people use. So we build in automatic timers with typically a minimum read time, a maximum read time in there. Audible alerts, so if you've gone off to make a cup of tea, that you cannot really miss it. And they will both prevent use too soon or too late. Then comes interpreting the test itself, and that largely comes down to reading the test, or at least that's largely where people assume the errors come. In well-controlled laboratory studies with experienced operators working under a quality system, you can probably get those errors down to less than 2%, but in less controlled situations where it's outside of that traditional clinical laboratory, you would probably expect the error rate to be, perhaps if you're lucky, less than 5% with lots of good training and good instruction. If you simply send a test kit out with just the instructions for use to follow, the literature is suggesting that you're going to get error rates of around about a quarter. So around about a quarter of people will not follow the correct timing advice. They will either not set a timer and measure it accurately, or they'll guess the time, or they'll get distracted and read it at the wrong time anyway. Or perhaps last week they were using a different manufacturer's kit, which was 10 minutes, and this week yours is 15 minutes. And so they're still using the 10 minutes because that's what their habit was. So that is probably the highest risk source of error in there, and we can easily remove the timing errors. But as well as that, you've got this reading error. So if someone is reading a test by eye, you will not get them to read it very accurately. There's no good data around on how good the human eye is at reading lines, but we see this kind of significant number of tests which are read wrong by eye, even when someone's had training specifically on how to do it. You get maybe 1 in 20 tests wrong read by eye. So that's where the whole Novarum concept began. It began about reading a test digitally and removing the human from interpretation. Whether that's the first time or the 1000th time you've done a test, you want to get the same result and you want to be confident in that result. Obviously, you might well want a permanent record. You might want to be able to account for different lot-to-lot variability. So particularly with quantitative tests, to have different calibration curves in there, but we even see it with qualitative tests now as well, where there's different cutoffs between different lots. And then you might want to consider other prior information. So if you know whether or not someone has symptoms of a disease, that can influence your decision. There's a study there about how that bias can impact people's decisions on whether or not they think that person, whether they think there was 2 lines on a test or not. We hear anecdotally very similar stories around pregnancy. If you want to be pregnant, you look really hard and see the line. If you don't, you take a cursory glance and throw it away. But there are proper ways of combining that sort of information. So in pregnancy, that might be the date of a cycle. In malaria, it might be whether someone has a fever, and you can then start to properly combine that information and come up with better results. And then, of course, as we talked about earlier, there are situations where you don't actually want to show the result to the user, either because you think they'll change their behavior or because you don't want them to change their behavior until they've been through some sort of counselling, or you want them to give some particular advice. So key thing there being that we can hide the result from the user but share it with their clinician. So I've just got some quick demo here to show you of how this would typically work in a use case. This is an app I've already logged into. I've actually already captured a picture of a passport in here, and I've input a bunch of patient details here. Just going to input the final field there. So I pick why we're doing this test, and that sort of information can be really useful to payers to understand why people are doing testing and is testing being used needlessly. I get some images to guide me through the instructions. I then scan a barcode, which is checking the lot number, and then I get a series of little videos that tell me how to do the test. So in this case, it's telling me to put the gloves on. It's going to tell me to open the packet and discard the desiccant, and then it will talk me through applying both the sample, which we have in the red bottle here, just because people get a bit squeamish if we start putting blood on the screen, or the buffer, which is in the white bottle. As well as just having videos, you can kind of augment that by having kind of additional information there. So you can have cartoons, doesn't need to be a video, can be an animation, can be static images, just depends on what works for your typical use case. And that's where we go back to the original kind of questions we ask. Who's the user? Why are they using it? How often are they using it? Timer's in here, and you'll see I've just skipped forward on this timer because we're running short on time. And then we have to, so there's a timer after you add the sample, and then you add the buffer. And then once we've added the buffer, we will start another timer, which would normally be for 3 minutes for this particular test. It runs very fast. But again, we'll just skip forward and use a sample that we've already got prepared. So there we go, skip forward. And then the read process. And this is where our key machine vision technology comes in. We recognize the geometry of the test. We use that to correct for the fact that the user has the test misaligned, so it's rotated, it's not sitting perfectly parallel. And then we give the results out to the user on screen. So positive, we've got all the data that was input there. And then just, I very quickly showed you there, you can get out, as well as the image of the test, a profile of what the test is looking like. So that brings us to the end of that section on the sort of errors that are cropping up and how you can help to deliver an entire solution rather than focusing just on the test result and just collecting data and sending it back to some sort of central location as well. So it's about understanding risks, designing to mitigate those risks. So this is coming into the usability engineering that question was about earlier. How do we add value to the user on the way? Well, adding value is not just about money. It can be about providing the user with greater confidence in the test result, making them think less about what that means and understand more about the outcomes. And then a key point here is that during the development, you should test early and often to optimize the workflow. It's very easy to develop these things in the office, writing code, develop these things with your own staff who are very familiar with the test and then miss something. Recently, we developed a test that involved a finger prick blood sample, and we had, I will admit, made a slight mistake in that we managed to put a split in the videos and require the user to tap the screen just at the point to say that they'd managed to prick their finger, just at the point that they had blood all over it. So it's about actually getting out there and testing that in the real use case scenario. And obviously, our development team are not pricking their finger every 5 minutes to work through the possible scenarios there. So test with real users as much as possible is really important, and do that in the real setting as well. So it's easy to do these things in the office environment, but if someone's going to be testing at home or in a tent, then try to get some testing done there with what the regulatory people would call formative studies, so that when you come to do your summative studies for validation, you've reduced as many of the things that can go wrong and engineered them out. Right, Roz, I'm aware that I am talking too much and we're running out of time, but I think we should have time.
We have a few questions, but I think, yeah, we'll crack on. The questions are relating to phone spec requirements for installing and also software requirements. So I think you'll be covering that in the next section anyway. So.
Yes, I possibly will. Yeah, so hopefully I'll cover them. If I haven't covered them at the end, then let's make sure that we pick them up.
Okay, thank you.
So I'm going to talk now about pitfalls, things that can go wrong during the development process that you can try to avoid. And one of those is about not really collecting enough data. So you really can't collect too much data as you go along. The earlier you start collecting it, the better. And one of the reasons we say that is that people often become a bit obsessed about the sensitivity and specificity of the tests, you know, those high 90% that they claim in their literature. But actually, you want to generate data that shows what the actual performance is in real human hands, if you like, in real users' hands. So often it might be that rather than trying to eke out another 0.5% sensitivity and specificity, by optimizing the assay, perhaps to clean up its background or improve a little bit of signal, it might be you can achieve 2 or 3% improvement by reducing errors earlier in the system. So making sure that someone doesn't make a mistake where they add the sample, those sorts of things, or getting the timing right. So by getting involved early, getting that data in early, you can start to understand where the errors really exist and whether actually it's all about the biologics in your system, which sometimes it is, or whether, as often is the case, it's actually going to be that most of the errors come from the user. And then if you need to get performance enhancement beyond that, then you can start to think early on about how you might change your claims, either for the app or for the product, or both combined as a system, so that actually it combines other information. So perhaps you can improve your diagnostic sensitivity if you know the age of the person as well as the outcome of the test, or if you know what their temperature is and therefore how febrile they are, as well as the test. And those sort of things can all be combined with fairly simple Bayesian statistics. You don't need to go into the world of artificial intelligence and the complications of validating that stuff. You can apply simple, more traditional statistical models to combine this information. I guess this is what Roz was talking about with the questions about which phones do we support, and we do see people who are keen to provide a phone or think they'll need to provide a phone. My simple mantra is that it's very much a bring your own device world now. People expect to be able to run an app on the phone that they have in their pocket anyway. They don't expect to have to go and get a special phone to run an app on. And so you should try to support as many different iOS and Android devices. So iOS is the operating system on Apple devices. So you want to support essentially all the latest iPhones and a very good proportion of the Android phones. And that involves looking at the demographics of your market. So if you are in the UK, the type of Android devices that are in circulation will be very different from if your market's focused on China or if it's focused on the US. Statistics are all around on those usage or distribution things, so you can work those out relatively easily. And then there are strategies that we have available if you want to try and support essentially every phone on the market as well. We can kind of steer people in the right direction there as to how to get the balance right between the phones you specifically validate on and those that you might let it work on. Typically, what we would say is it's almost impossible to go and buy a new smartphone today that our applications would not run on. Some of them obviously run a lot faster than others. The video you saw there was real-time video of how quickly we will scan a test on an iPhone 7. That's pretty old by today's standards, and you can get the same sort of performance out of any phone that's £200 upwards, really. But you still get perfectly usable results now out of a phone that costs £100, $120, that sort of price. The other thing that people get kind of a bit hung up on in terms of phones is regulatory, and does the phone itself become a medical device? Well, no, it doesn't. The phone itself has no intended medical use when it's supplied to you. You go to the Apple store or you go online and you order your Samsung device, and it has no intended medical use at that point. So it is not a medical device at that point. You will be supplying a mobile application which has a medical intended use. So that is software as a medical device. The rules and regulations on that are very clear. It's very straightforward to follow. The FDA have provided a lot of guidance from quite a long time now, which guides people as to which types of claims will fall into being a regulated device. But essentially, if you are doing something with a lateral flow type test, an IVD type test, if that test in itself is regulated, so in other words, it's testing human beings, then it's almost certain that any app that is an accessory to that test will also be a medical device. So the app must be developed as though it's a medical device with all of the controls and processes in place. But that doesn't turn the phone itself into a medical device. The one possible exception to that is if you start doing things like providing a phone, particularly if you lock that phone down so it will only run the app that you've put on it. Then you start getting into, at the very least, a grey area, if not into a regulatory minefield where you might need to control things that are going on in the phone, which you are just buying from Samsung or Huawei or whoever's providing them. Then the other pitfall that we see and mistake we see people making is reinventing the wheel. So we often see people who want to provide an entire solution. And I do talk at the start there about providing an entire solution for the patient. It doesn't mean you need to do it all yourself, and it doesn't mean that you need to recreate things that already exist. So we talk about offering an ecosystem. So we say the easiest way to do that is that you provide an API, that's an application programming interface, the way that two different bits of software will talk to each other, which lets your software talk to existing systems, whether that's electronic health record systems, or whether that's an existing data repository somewhere, or allows another system that you've granted permission to connect to and access the system. I think classic mistake is not to think about all the different users. So they focus only on perhaps the patient testing at home and ignore the needs that your own staff will have. So you'll have a QC operator testing in your facility who's got very different needs and certainly doesn't want to have to wait for 20-minute timers every time they make a measurement, because they will line up multiple tests one after the other and have their own little stopwatch running. Your marketing team might want data out of the system, and often that's ignored when the system's designed. And then it's easy to focus too much on the patient, but think about all the other people as well. And if you design that stuff in early, you'll start to extract the value from it early. This is a little slide. I'll skim over this for speed, but essentially, Product Board, who are a product management software company, have these characteristics, or these 4 personalities that they identify as people that get in the way of project management. And essentially, I'll let you read those at your own leisure, but they are people who will essentially hinder the proper definition of what your product needs to be, either the most important person in the room in terms of salary or position in the organization, or someone who's got really strong opinions but no evidence to back them up, or the person who's dealing with whatever's gone wrong today rather than what's going to happen in a year's time. So you'll get access to the slides later, and you can review that yourself. So if you search for Product Board, you'll find those examples. They are the classic things that we see hindering projects progressing. And then the other things that we see are people not really considering how to exploit the value. It's very tempting, and often it is the right thing to do, to give away an app free of charge, to encourage use of the test, and to support that test and perhaps differentiate yourself from competition. But it's also potentially leaving money on the table, or potentially ignoring an opportunity there. So we would say, if you haven't made it mandatory, so if it's not an essential element of your system, if it's not compulsory within your instructions for use to read the test with an app and to use the app as part of the process, then you're spending a lot of money developing something which people have the option not to use, and that's probably not the best idea in the world. But it may be you're offering premium functionality there, in which case perhaps you should be charging for that. Generally speaking, we would suggest people don't charge for downloading the app, because Apple and Google will take 30% of the sales price there. But you can have subscription models where someone's paying for ongoing access to the data they've collected. And that is not something that Apple and Google take a cut of if you set it up right. Almost finished talking about where things go wrong. The other thing that people do is they ignore the fact that mobile is a rapidly changing landscape. And I guess that makes sense. So nothing in diagnostics changes very fast normally. You know, we're talking product development cycles usually of 2-3 years, whereas Apple are bringing out phones on a constant basis. The operating system's constantly updating, and all of the Android developers are kind of playing the same game as well. So you've got dozens of new phones coming out all the time, and Android and iOS both getting updated as well. So you've got to really think about how you can keep on top of that. You need a partner who will manage and maintain the software for you, but you also need to make sure that you're continually thinking about how you update and revolutionize what you're doing. Otherwise, people will start to feel the technologies become dated. Again, I think the projects where we see the greatest success are those where the product manager really understands their end user and really understands how they're changing their habits and how they're changing the way they interact with the software and with the test kit, and so is able to kind of steer the direction for that. And without doubt, our greatest success projects are those where we have a dedicated product manager on the other end. you're building an entire service, not just a product. I'm conscious we've got 2 minutes left, so let me just quickly rattle through what we've got left. 3 key things that we need to engage with you. We need the user stories from you that we talked about. You develop them from the questions we asked at the start. You need to have your test, and if you don't have your test, of course, BBI's got other teams of people who are happy to help you develop a new test. If you're test in development, we're happy to engage during the development cycle as well, and often that makes sense. And we need to know where the data is going to go. It doesn't need to exist. We can create it for you. It may be that you don't know all the details, but if you don't have any idea about that, then we probably have a black hole in the project there, and it's not going to get off to a great start. You don't need to have the 3 C's that comes next to engage with us, but it will certainly make it much easier for us to understand your proposition. And certainly by the time we get to writing proposals, we normally like to have at least started to thrash these out. So what's the clinical value of your solution? Not just the test, but what clinically does the app hope to bring on top of that? What's the commercial value, as we've just talked about there, in terms of making sure you're getting the right money for it? And then how are you going to tackle the challenge of introducing this in the market and getting this rolled out? People don't just start to change their behavior and use an app overnight. So is that, you're going to make it mandatory? Is it a new product where it's part of the offering from the start? And I will just very quickly mention this case study. We've got a number of case studies on the website which you can go and look at. This particular one is for Billman Laboratories, fully quantitative solution for patients measuring calprotectin at home. Calprotectin is a biomarker for people with Crohn's and ulcerative colitis, and they can track that disease themselves. And we've built a number of features there which I've already talked about, like application programming interfaces, so secure access is available to hospitals to access that data. Why would you choose to come to BBI, and why would you choose to use the Novarum technology? Well, fundamentally, you would be looking to use technology that wants to just use the phone that's already in your pocket. We've already proven it's robust and scalable, and we can get you quick proof of concept, so we can quickly prove that it will work. We do that using our patent protected imaging technology, and that's a key reason why people might choose to come to us, is for that imaging capability, and for the freedom to operate that extends. We build the software up from modules, so you're not building an entire project from scratch. If we need a timer, we've already got a timer module, and likewise for all the other features you've seen, and many, many more which we didn't have time to talk about today. We're completely agnostic as to where the data goes. That's not the same for everyone, so it doesn't need to come back to our servers. We don't own the data. We don't have any interest in the data. We just want to provide you the tools you need to run your service. So if it goes direct from the phone to your servers, direct from your phone to a hospital system, that's all acceptable too. And then we will hand you a complete design history file at the end of the project. That will give you a very good start to everything you need for regulatory compliance, because we built that with ISO 13485 and IEC 62304 in mind, and that gives us a real advantage over a classic mobile developer who will have no idea about developing mobile applications for medical use. So that is an idea of what it is that we are capable of doing. To understand what we can do for a specific project, I would suggest the best thing to do is to reach out to your contacts at BBI, and our BDM team will be happy to discuss those projects, what the right time to engage is and how best to engage, and extract and help you to think about some of those issues we've flagged up about the who, the what's and the whys, and then get some time with me or one of the guys in my team who will help to perhaps sketch out what an app might look like, or produce you a proposal for how we go about developing an app in partnership with you. Right, I have run 2 minutes over and not left ourselves any time for questions, but I am available to keep answering questions. So Roz, I'm happy to stay on and do that if people have got questions.
Great, thank you, Neil. There are a couple. I think you covered most of the device and hardware questions. But if people do want to drop off now, just before we go into the questions, I'd like to say thank you so much for attending today, and we hope you found it, informative, and thank you, Neil, for your presentation. You will all receive a copy of the recorded webinar in the next few days, so hopefully you can do that at your leisure. Also, there will be a feedback survey coming through to you after this event as well, so if you are able to complete that, we really do appreciate it, and it helps us to understand, obviously, how we can better serve you and provide future content that's of interest. So if you're dropping off now, thank you very much. For those who want to stay for questions, I'll go with the ones that have already been posed, Neil. So the first one is, how do you overcome differences in illumination conditions, intensity and wavelengths?
Yeah, so at the simplest level, and we don't have time to give the full detailed answer here, so happy to discuss that in more detail with whoever asked that question separately. But the simple answer is we manage the exposure on the camera, so we can tell the exposure level on the camera, we can adjust that as necessary. For most tests, we will turn the flash on in the camera, so the LED flash, which means you're illuminating it from 6 inches away instead of 6 feet away like it's meant to do. So that would massively overexpose most tests. And then we have to scale back the exposure to compensate for that. That gives us a huge amount of control on the lighting and means it's almost irrelevant whether someone's doing it in daylight or in complete darkness. And then actually, for most measurements, we are making measurements of luminosity rather than the color, so the wavelength is not actually a significant factor in that measurement. So that's a very quick answer to what could be an hour-long presentation in itself.
Thank you, Neil. Another question we've had then is, can existing pictures of test results be used for application development?
We would say no. And I know that possibly there are some other people that do work on that approach. We actually produce a little tool, another app that we use for application development so that you can quickly start to collect data and we can start to optimize and analyze that. But we want to control the capture of the image for exactly the lighting issues that were mentioned to make sure it's lined up. And actually, what I didn't mention was during that capture process, we're typically capturing not one image, but on average 10 images during that few seconds where the phone is reading the test, and then we'll average the results from those. So one image is typically not good enough. And then finally, the other reason we don't like doing that is that most of those images will have artifacts from the way they've been saved in there, so compression artifacts that make the image small enough to justify saving on your phone or your camera, and those JPEG compression artifacts mean that what you see then is not the same as what you see in a finished application.
Thank you, that's very interesting, and I think it is partly answering this question that's being posed, which is each smartphone has different image sensors, different lighting and different camera settings. So how can we solve the difference in the results?
Yeah, so what we see is actually very small variations between different phones. There are obviously variations between the cameras and differences between the phones, but because of the things I was talking about there in terms of how we control the lighting and the fact that we're actually not that sensitive to the color of the line, we don't really care whether it's red or blue unless that is how the test needs to be read. Then we manage most of those things out. There are small variations between phones. In the most sensitive tests, you may want to calibrate individual phone models. So if you're trying to do quantitative stuff, some people will calibrate individual phone models, either at the manufacturer's facility, they'll calibrate 100 phones that they want to support, or we do sometimes provide a card that can be used to essentially benchmark a phone in the field. So before someone starts using the app for the first time, they benchmark their particular phone. But for most tests, that's not necessary. We can accommodate the variation between phones. I mean, much the same way that you can accommodate variation between people's eyesights in visually read tests and variation between batches of tests as well. The phone variation is a small error compared to those.
That's great. Thanks for the detailed answer there, Neil. Another question, and I think this is the last one we've had, and I'm not sure how you can answer this, but there's interest in as to whether we are looking at extending the Novarum application to COVID-19 lateral flow test reading?
Yeah, I can answer that. There are no secrets there. That everyone in the diagnostics industry is actively working on COVID-19 products, either for antibody or antigen testing. So it will come as no surprise to anyone that we are also working on solutions in those areas for a number of manufacturers. So yeah, absolutely, we have solutions in the pipeline for manufacturers there, particularly to try and get testing out of central laboratories and into patients' own hands.
That's great. Thank you, Neil. And that is the last question we've had through. So once again, to those that have stayed on the line, thank you so much for attending. Stay safe, and we hope to see you at a future webinar. Goodbye.
Thanks, Roz.
Thanks, Neil.